take a little bit of a side here to talk about a conversation I had this week with my aunt down. I was visiting my mom, and my aunt was visiting from Oregon, and we had this really interesting conversation about good and bad, right and wrong. And I started thinking a little bit about the arguments people have, whether it's right versus left of the political spectrum, religion versus no religion, all these arguments about what morality is, and all the gray areas of how much freedom people really need. And I started thinking about four different questions or categories that are kind of an interesting framework for this. And it just so happens they kind of fall into the elements as well. But number one is, how much freedom is an optimal amount of freedom? How much freedom do we want us, humanity to have? And it's different based on age, obviously, based on your situation. But it's a good question to try to come up with some kind of framework for and dig into it. So amount of freedom is number one. Number two is amount of equality. How much how much more important is president versus a serf, or a million people versus one people, or young versus old? And it's just how much equality is the right amount of equality. And this kind of goes back to UBI and how much is enough. What's the minimum standard? But again, it's something that's never an easy answer, but it's worth posing that question to everybody in the world. What is the right amount of equality for you? And how do we kind of get the whole world to agree on at least some answers? So that's amount of freedom, amount of equality. And then three is balance with nature. How do you, because equality is just human equality, and then you have the nature equality, which is the earth prospect of how we work with nature. And then the fourth one would be, again, robotics, automation, and kind of present term thinking versus future term thinking. How important is right now versus how important is the future? So if you just roll all those four kind of questions into almost any discussion, you can kind of get into some interesting ideas and interesting progress on how to find good answers for it, better and better answers for it. A lot of people, what I found from this is they throw up their hands and they don't want to try to answer these questions because they're too complicated. But humanity's been answering them for thousands of years, and we're getting better and better answers to these four questions every day. So it was kind of a bit of an epiphany when I phrased it that way, and how almost any single question in the world fits into one of those four things, really. Just like the pillars and just like everything else we've talked about. And it's just a fun way to phrase it. Have you heard, does that make sense?
Sure. In philosophy, there are a few fundamental questions that are continuously being discussed, and one of them is definitely the question of freedom, of what it is, and it's not just in terms of how much. It's more of a kind of a thing of like a quality of freedom. I think Hannah Arendt wrote a whole treatise about one of I guess the most famous female philosopher. She wrote a pretty good thesis about the kinds of freedom. And I once, when I had it as an assignment to read it and to comment on it at university, I sort of put it into a diagram where you could put sort of a bit like a zodiac type thing. You could put it into, like, it's actually turned out to be 12 different types of freedom, and that she differently described, which you can sort of display in like four different groupings of three, because they are even like of the 12, three are more related always to each other than the other groups of three. So sort of like elements again, like fire, water, air, earth types of freedom, but perfectly matching it. So in this sense, like freedom is a question of what do you mean by freedom, I think, more so than how much, even though that's, I guess, sort of contained within, or that's
Yeah,
implied in
similar
the how
question.
much question. With
Yeah.
the equality, again, that's I guess, the next big one. I think sometimes it's equality and justice, or fair equality, justice, fairness, are sort of
Yeah.
like related terms for what humans intuitively understand to be the same thing. So that's the second biggest, if you can even compare these, like, in size relatively, questions of freedom and questions of justice, fairness, or equality. But those are most of what philosophers throughout history have been discussing. Then there have been some relatively recent developments that I think also need to be addressed, like technology and robotics, which weren't a big part of most of the history of philosophy, because technology wasn't a big part of most of the history of philosophy. And what was the fourth thing that you
Fourth
mentioned?
thing was, so freedom, equality, then nature, balance
Nature,
with
right?
nature.
Environmentalism,
And
right?
environmentalism.
That's
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 another
that's
whole
the
problem.
that's the environmentalism is, I guess, that has started to be covered in philosophy in modern times.
Yep.
That has been a couple of decades.
Yep.
So yes, so yeah, so it would make sense like freedom, equality, environmentalism, and technology. Though the order
Yep.
should be the technology and nature, because then it's also again the four elements.
Yep. So
Because
technology's wind, nature's
freedom
earth, freedom
freedom
is
is
kind of
fire,
fire,
because
freedom's
it's
fire, right? And
self-determination.
then
Also, the
equality
symbol
is
of
water.
liberty is a torch.
Yep. That's
So
exactly right.
because that's about you personally, individually determining yourself. Equality,
Yep.
just slash justice slash fairness is water, because that's about community relations with
Exactly.
other
Yeah.
people and being just and kind to them. So again, it
Yeah.
always breaks down to those
It
four
is.
elements.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it kind of hit me on in the 10-hour drive home, and I was thinking of these questions, and it just made sense. It fits into the puzzle so well when you start to think about things these ways, and it's what I really enjoy most about these
But
conversations,
do you
is how
know
it
do
all
you know
connects
what
together.
the fifth element is?
I can't remember if we talked about that. What was it again?
We haven't talked about it yet.
No,
It's just
I
there's
don't think we have.
also like in
What's the fifth?
traditional philosophy, there's also a concept of the fifth element, which in modern times maybe you've seen the movie Fifth Element, and they actually played with
Yeah.
that, where there were the four elements that they had to set up: the fire, water, air thing, and then there Lilu, the divine being character, was the fifth element. So if you wanted
Okay.
the fifth element is spirit,
Spirit,
meaning it's sort of
sentience, almost
so it's like the
sentience.
transcendental divine
Okay.
dimension. So
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
anything in addition to that to consider, then the spiritual, meaning like the whole counterpart to earthly existence, is essentially
Hmm.
that's the only like thing you could add in that model that would be extra
Okay.
or not covered by the four
Interesting.
things.
Yeah.
So
Okay. That's neat. I didn't really realize. Yeah, that makes sense though.
that just to
Um.
complete the model. But for earthly affairs, the four elements should always suffice to cover all the bases of what people
Very
would
cool.
agree are real phenomena.